Chaos causes organizations to retreat, but not always. And if you joined us for the last learning session, you probably noticed a huge list of companies we explored and talked about who were actually founded during periods of global economic recession. These time periods are interesting because chaos creates opportunity, chaos changes the rules, chaos reshuffles the deck. It switches who's in the lead and leads to what we call chaos-induced recharting, which is the concept that we go from a world that is path-dependent into a period of crisis like we're in right now, which leads us to a period where things start changing around in a predictable way. We use the word chaos, but chaos is in fact predictable, and if you're able to spot new consumer needs, you can rechart the path that you're on. So we went through last time these 4 different phases, and in today's series of lessons, we're going to dive a lot deeper. In fact, we're going to dive 5 whole lessons deeper with the content that first started off with my big career break, which was Exploiting Chaos, a book I'd written a dozen years ago. It was timed right around the market sort of uncertainty. The market collapsed, and suddenly I became the chaos guy for hundreds of different brands, and I learned a lot from each one. And I didn't know if that was going to be the most relevant book topic, but in March I republished it as Create the Future in the Innovation Handbook, updating with all sorts of lessons about chaos that I'd learned over the last dozen years working with so many wonderful brands like each of you. So we're going to dive in the series, the 5-part series, into 5 different sets of lessons that are all mapped against the framework that is in Create the Future and that we use for our future festivals. Today's lesson is going to be about the ability to change, which is going to dive into how to create a culture of innovation during a time period of chaos. Next, we'll get into how to actually spot evolving consumer needs and identify new opportunities, particularly when the environment is chaotic and different from the markets we were in before. That's going to lead us to how you would methodically and adaptively innovate in a different way to navigate chaotic territories. And finally, you might have a great idea, but if you're not able to break through all of the noise, then you're not going to get the buy-in you need internally, the end consumers, all that wonderful stuff. So without further ado, we're going to dive into the ability to change. Those of you who are at Future Festival in the last 6 months have seen a lot of this particular section, which is about the 7 paths to path dependency. And if you're brand new with us, this will be all new, and the next 4 lessons will also be all new. So let's dive into the ability to change. Now, the lesson I like to kick off with, this story to capture your attention, is about horse dimensions and spaceships. Now, those 2 things might seem unrelated, but they are more related than you might think. In fact, as a clever innovator, as an analytic person, you would maybe expect that there should actually be horses in space. And in fact, if you're very clever, you would expect that there are 2 horses in space. And if you're interested in horse dimensions, which not everyone is, you would tell me that you would expect those horses to be 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. This whole thing seems like I've derailed you. Why are we talking about horse dimensions in space? But it's for a purpose, because that width of 2 horses is the width that was used to determine the width of NASA's solid rocket boosters. And that might seem pretty weird. If you want to fact check it, you're going to have to go back pretty far in time. And what you're going to learn when you learn about horse dimensions is that in the Roman Empire, the Romans had the biggest empire because they patrolled that empire with the 2-horse Roman war chariot. The war chariot allowed them to have the biggest land and territory, but it tore up the little highways of Europe, creating ruts on all of the little dirt roads. And if you were a little farmer and you drove your wagon through those ruts, you might break a wagon wheel. And if you did, you might be a little bit upset, and you would make your next wagon more carefully by, if you were clever, measuring the width of the ruts in the road. And you'd learn that those ruts are 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. So pretty soon everyone is making wagons the same width as the Roman war chariot, 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. Next up, we get wagonways, which are carts pulled by horses in and out of the gold mines, put on tracks that are 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. Europeans invent the first train tracks, and they put them on tracks that are 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. Pretty soon Americans come out with their own trains and put them on tracks that are 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. There are some bullet trains in the world that go 200 miles an hour on tracks that are 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. And so in NASA needs to ship the solid rocket boosters from Utah to Florida, they must put them on tracks that are 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. Now, if you fact check me, you might tell me, oh, but Jeremy, the width of the solid rocket boosters overlaps the width of the track, but it doesn't change the fact that the width is determined based on the width of 2 horses' butts. Now, that might seem a little bit wild. How does that happen? And yet it goes to show us that we're in this weird sort of world where that width is stupid. We're probably worse off for it. But in the space that we're in, we're more dependent on our past decisions than we like to think. We want to stick to the rules, the best practices, the common standard. And as a result, you can end up making things for outer space based on Roman war chariots. Everyone wants innovation to happen, but most people don't break from the path. And that's why our first lesson in the Chaos series is all about how to make change actually happen. Here we are enduring crisis and even chaotic times, and yet we'll get back to work and still encounter much of the resistance that we had before. We'll go back to repeating many of the decisions we've done in the past. And so what I want to do is push you to think about the other pathways you could be on. What opportunity lies so close within your path? And maybe for you that's a bigger role. It might be a new product, a new service, or just a different way of doing things. Innovation can mean a whole wide range of creative change. And we're going to talk about how to actually make it happen. How to recognize those other pathways that are close within your grasp. Now, as you embark upon innovation and chaos, and you think about the ability to change, there are 7 traps that we need to talk about and understand. The first is the subtlety of disruptive new ideas. Next, we'll dive into neurological shortcuts and how our brain's high performance can limit our thinking. Then we'll get into the traps that impact successful people, optionality and the reality that we make fewer big decisions in life than we give ourselves credit for. Next up, we'll dive into linear thinking and how our world might be in a world of exponential change, but our brain fundamentally likes to think in a predictable way. We'll get into the discomfort of trying something new, and we'll wrap up by talking about the ease of inaction. Now, these 7 paths are the paths that I call the 7 traps of path dependency. The term path dependency is a psychological term that comes to us from the 50s and 60s, and so that part's not revolutionary, but I like to apply it to modern day innovation and chaos because it helps to explain the reality that we stick to the path that we're on. And yet if you could think disruptively, you would better break out of the path that you've been on and be more likely to see the opportunity arising in times of chaos, the new ways to pivot, and ultimately those paths that are so close within your grasp. So let's dive in then. And first I want to talk about the subtlety of disruptive ideas. Smart and clever people so often are misunderstood or maybe even misunderstand the potential of their own idea. So I'm going to go through a couple examples, and the first one you can probably guess. You're going to say, oh, Jeremy, he's going to tell us about Thomas Edison bringing the light bulb to England, and they probably didn't see the potential. Sure. But here's what I found. I found that back in the day, they didn't used to just reject your idea. They used to like to reject them and insult them. And to make this virtual learning session a little more fun, I found the actual insults for you. So for good old Tommy E, he brought the light bulb to England, and they told him that his idea was unworthy of the attention of practical or scientific men. Maybe if they talked to the ladies, England would have had light. Next example, Western Union and the telephone. Western Union would have been the natural acquirer of the telephone patent when Alexander Graham Bell offered to sell it to them for $100,000. And the reason why Western Union was so significant is that in the 1800s, if you wanted to send a business telegram, you went to Western Union. That was the telegram company. And yet, when they saw the phone, what they saw was something that looked awkward, and so they rejected Alexander Graham Bell and insulted him, telling him his idea was idiotic. Why would any person want to use this ungainly and impractical device? Walt Disney used to be employed by the Kansas City Star until they rejected him and insulted him, firing him with the note that he lacked imagination and had no good ideas. Which brings me to Ferruccio, probably my favorite story in the mix. You see, Ferruccio was a creative problem solver. He was an innovative thinker, and basically after World War II, he used those skills to start fixing up abandoned war machines and turning them into farm machines. And pretty soon, he got good at it, and he decided to start selling and making his own tractors. And pretty soon, he was a millionaire. And as a millionaire, he got himself a Ferrari. But he wasn't a regular Ferrari driver. He had the Ferrari coat, he had the Ferrari hat. He was very excited to go to the Ferrari track meets, where one day he met up with Enzo Ferrari. And he went up to Enzo and he said, hey Enzo, I actually have a way to make your Ferrari better. I know how to fix the terrible clutch that you had. But Enzo didn't like being told what to do, so he rejected him and insulted him, telling him, you may be able to drive a tractor, but not a Ferrari. You stick to making tractors, and I'll make the cars. Pretty wild story, hey? What? You want more? Okay, what if I tell you his last name? Lamborghini! And to this day, Ferruccio's company still does make tractors. It's just that some of them look like that. What a lesson. Now, I'm going to go through a couple of these a little faster, and you've heard some of these things, I guess, this example here, Kodak, but I've gone a little bit further, and I've interviewed all of these people that were involved in the teams, and I've always found it surprising to hear how much they loved their job and how they generally felt supported. So Steve Sasson in 1975 invented digital photography. Kodak let him explore and experiment all the time. And so he loved that. But they never commercialized his ideas quite properly because their culture revolved around beating Fuji with the perfect Kodak quality print. And because of that, he could never imagine, or they couldn't imagine, rolling out a digital camera until it could make a better photo than Fuji's silver halide photography. To me, he said, a company's great culture can be the seed to your own destruction. A couple other examples. Xerox invented personal computing, the graphic user interface, the mouse. People think those things were invented by Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. No, those guys went on tours in the 80s at Xerox, and Xerox didn't even patent the personal computer because the good money was in photocopiers. Smith Corona invented the laptop word processor, the grammar checker, the spell checker, saving to a disk. And their machine looked a lot less clumsy than the computers with all their peripherals of the 1990s. And despite this, they actually started making computers in 1990. But in 1991, a global economic recession hit. And when that did, the team said, hey, everyone in the computer group, come back to head office and help us work through the typewriter business. We'll get back to computers in a few years. 3 years later, Smith Corona declares bankruptcy for the very first time, and the joint venture partner whom they abandoned, Acer, goes on to make computers, being the second largest computer maker in the world. Wow. HP was pitched 3 times by their employee, Wozniak, who wanted to get into personal computers. Atari was approached by Apple and Steve Jobs, who they employed. He wanted to give them a 33% stake in his new venture, Apple, for $50,000, which would have paid off. EDS had a chance to buy Microsoft. Microsoft counteroffered with a $60 million offer, but it was rejected. Excite offered to purchase Google for $800,000, and Google basically responded saying, no, we won't sell for less than $1 million. MySpace could own Facebook, Yahoo could own Facebook, Britannica could have been Carta, and Carta could have been Wikipedia, and Blockbuster Video had 3 chances to buy Netflix for $50 million. Now, once again, I interview the teams here, and if you really want to dive into it, what's interesting is that the good money came from snacks. The movie money went to Hollywood. And so even though Blockbuster started pioneering online video streaming Even though Blockbuster caught up to Netflix in 6 months, once they did and Netflix panicked, offering to sell, the board of directors had to take a look at the offer. And they said, no, the good money comes from snacks. CEO, you're fired. New CEO comes to us from 7-Eleven. Yes, get us some of that snack money. Return us to snack goodness. Stop talking to Netflix and fire the online team. You make like one bad decision, you know? But then I wouldn't have my favorite Twitter account, the last Blockbuster store. If you plan on coming in today, just tweet me and I'll run it over and open up the store. Sometimes we get excited when cars pull into our lots, but it turns out they're just divorced parents passing along their children. And a lot of people don't know this, but we own a large portion of Netflix. Just kidding, our electricity just got shut off. And you know, every single person listening to this lesson right now, all of us could have been more financially successful if we took every dollar we earned and poured it into Amazon pretty much at any point in time, even the current economic scenario that we're in. But we don't, because new ideas seem awkward. A couple of geeks who sketched out some software could destroy Sears? I don't think so, until they did. Opportunity starts off subtle and awkward. In fact, if we went through 50 or 100 more examples of overlooked opportunity, I think what you would find most intriguing is that you can find these examples not just with random people missing out on the opportunity, but actually more likely the market leader misses out on the opportunity, and a time period of chaos, crisis, or recession is the time period that resets the rules, causing the incumbent player to lose and a new player to come in. These new ideas seem sort of awkward or different, but then once chaos ensues, people are willing to try that new option, and the incumbent maybe at the same time is a bit more conservative, the markets shuffle, and then these periods of chaos are when the market leader actually exchanges. It happens because people, smart people in particular, successful people, successful companies, overestimate their level of control consistently. In fact, 97% of Fortune 500 CEOs in this last few years state that innovation is one of their top priorities. It's one of the things they're best at. It's in their DNA. But that's all of them. 97%, that's all of them. How's that possible? And it's because we think we have this higher level of control, we prioritize innovation, and yet in our research at Trend Hunter, with 30 or 40,000 people doing our innovation assessment, we know that about half of people don't feel like their organization has a strong innovation plan, half don't think their organization adapts fast enough, half don't believe that they have enough time to work on new ideas, and half don't believe their organization knows how to turn ideas into reality. That data is pre-COVID-19. So imagine that in these last few years, we've run into a scenario where all of the CEOs want innovation to happen, companies think and have it in their ego that they're great at innovation, and yet we know that almost everyone, half of the people, feel unsupported and as if their organization can't adapt. And now? Well, now we enter chaos where people have to adapt. So which are the organizations that are going to shake out of this? Everyone wants innovation to happen, but most people don't break from the path. Now, the workshop question for this section on disruptive ideas is more simply to ask yourself, what can you do to encourage disruptive thinking? And that could mean in your own personal time, or with your teams, or within your company as a cultural whole. And some of the tactics I'll suggest, but I'll just do them very quickly here. They all could have a lot more depth to think about, would be, how do you find more ways to assume you're incorrect? How could you be more open to new ideas? How could you better reward and encourage dissent? Where could you case study emerging trends? And finally, how might you better embrace diversity? This brings me to our second trap of path dependency, which would be our neurological shortcuts. This is probably my favorite section, but it's also the one that's the most fun to do in a group exercise or workshop. So I'm going to have a couple little challenges for you to think about from the comfort of your own home. So when I think about neurological shortcutting, my favorite lessons all stem to our habits, our behaviors, and how we improve. I'll give you a couple examples. Think about the first time J.K. Rowling picked up a pen. What about the first time that Oprah Winfrey grabbed a microphone, or that time Serena Williams grabbed a racket? When they did it for the first time, they had to think about it. They had to fumble around and figure things out. And yet, fast forward 10,000 hours or whatever it might have been, and they became experts. It's easy, it's natural. Now, similarly for you, whatever you're best at, especially career-wise, it's become so natural now that you might forget about what it was like that first time you began. And the reason is that our brain structure physically changes with something called myelin. And many of you might already know about myelin, but we're going to look at it in terms of innovation and change. So think about myelin like a series of little highways in your brain that accounts for about 40% of your brain's mass. And here's how it works. Just kidding. Here's how it works. You try something new, like driving a car for the very first time, and the first time you get in the car, you accelerate, you get up to speed, only, just kidding, that's a dog. But a year in, or in that first year, it's kind of difficult, and you really have to think through all of the little steps. But then a year or two in maybe, it's like orange chocolate mocha frappuccino, and you figured out how to drive. In your head, what differentiates us and our brain structure from the animals is that we're really good at making new neural pathways with myelin. You figure something out, and to do that, you need to make a new neural pathway. But once you start to practice something, the repetitive neural impulse starts to look familiar, and so your brain decides to pave it with a little white fatty tissue highway of myelin. And that highway tells the neural impulse where to go next time. And next time you can do things a little bit better and faster. And as you practice something over and over, once you get your 10,000 hours established, what happens is that myelin pathway ends up so caked up, so fast, that your top pathways can actually be 100 times faster than in areas where you're trying something new. Now, what does that mean for innovation and change? It means once you become good at something, that's how you do it. And the more successful you become in your career, you'll be faster, but now you won't want to do things in a different way. And I like to prove it in a couple ways. The easy way, the starting way, and I know you're doing this from the comfort of your own home, but indulge me on this one thing. Cross your arms as fast as you can. Just give it a try. I know your house, but cross your arms as fast as you can. Now, uncross your arms, shake it off a little bit, and cross your arms, but the opposite way, the exact opposite way. Well, the second time it's a lot more difficult. It shouldn't be, and it's not like it's a terribly insurmountable task, but it's weird, because the second time you have to think about it. You kind of have to calculate where things go, and your brain has to tell your arms what to do. Whereas in the way you've done things 1,000 times, it's a myelinated pathway. You don't actually think about it. And what happens on a grander level when we go beyond crossing your arms is that myelin in your job, in your role, it makes you better, makes you faster, makes things easier, things become smoother, more consistent. But at the same time, myelin makes us stubborn, repetitive, complacent, resistant, and dismissive. And those are all really bad in a time period of chaos and change because, well, our old ways now don't seem to work. Now, I can prove how this limits our career choices in a couple ways, but the fun way I like to do is with a paper clip exercise, and it's actually a business case and a game all in one. So many of you remember Clippy from Windows XP. Hopefully you're not still on XP, but Clippy was legendary. And in honor of Clippy, he used to say things like, "Hi, it looks like you're trying to write a passive-aggressive letter to your neighbor. Can I help?" In honor of Clippy, who used to slow your computer down, do a little dance, and come up with advice, I want you to think about what can you do with a paper clip? What can you do? What can you fold with it? How can you use it? And I've done this in 100 or so groups, and I'll encourage you to do it with your family. Give it a shot, and I'll tell you what happens. In almost every group, the ideas that I start to hear would be you could pick a lock, you could use it as a weapon, you could trade it, you could clip paper together, you can use a money clip, you can use a tie clip, you could short circuit something, you could have earrings or a necklace, buy your wife something nicer. But the point would be, I can guess what people would say in almost every room. And if you take this list or screenshot it, give this a shot with your team, with your family, and what you'll find is the average group of adults gets to 10 to 15 ideas, and those ideas are predictable. In fact, almost all of those ideas will be the ones listed on the screen. But if you do this with a kindergarten child, you could get up to 200 ideas. And in some of my other videos, I do this with my niece Allie, and you can be amazed with what she comes up with. But then when you think about it, kids are more creative. So what's happening? Well, all of us are becoming more intelligent, and in some ways we're more creative, but in our raw creativity, we actually start to experience a limit. And the paperclip exercise and others would generally show we lose about 95% of our raw creative ideas. And what's actually happening is all related to myelin. So in your brain, you could come up with 200 ideas for a paperclip. I believe you if you're really put to task on it. But our myelin speeds us up by narrowing our focus and trying to get us to see the things we've seen or decided or done before. And that narrow thinking is why I could predict which ideas in a given group will come up. But also, it might be helpful for time periods where you need to make a fast decision, but it's terrible for innovation and terrible for change, and it's not terrific for these time periods of chaos. The implication is that you do have other great ideas that are within your grasp, but what you must be careful about as a professional is that your profession, your expertise, is the area where you experience the most narrowing of your field. So how do you retrain your brain? Well, largely it's about workshops, and there's all different workshops you could do. There's dozens of different workshops. If you want a list of them, talk to our team or check out, Create the Future, or look up anything online. What you'll find, though, is that the best workshops will be any workshop where you're forcing yourself to look at your problem from different perspectives, because you're trying to break out of your myelin pathway so that you could see the potential ideas that were actually within your grasp, but maybe not seen because of myelin. A couple little examples. How might you simulate your own disruption? How would other companies approach your market? What if Amazon decided to get in your market? Oh, but they wouldn't. Well, that's what the grocery stores thought. What about Facebook? How would they look at your world differently? Patagonia only believes in saving the world and sustainability. How would they look at what your company is doing? You could also do hackathons. You can role play the future. You can case study other markets and try and bring big implications back. You can imagine your dystopia versus your utopia where things work out, etc., etc. Now, my objective in this particular online lesson is not to walk through how the different workshops might work or to give you any real best practices, unfortunately, in workshops, but it's more simply to give you the takeaway that innovation is not fluffy, it's a science. And when you go through the actual methodologies of just trying to look at your problem from different perspectives, you actually are building new myelin pathways and you're getting your brain retrained to look at your problem from different perspectives. Because everyone wants innovation to happen, but most people don't break from the path. The workshop question for this section would be, how could you retrain your brain to more proactively hunt opportunity? And the tactics would be finding opportunities to bring different teams together, proactively soliciting ideas, funding creative hobbies, tracking trends in other markets, or simply running ongoing workshops with your team. All right, this brings us to our next trap, which is the trap of success. Now, a million years ago, we were hunters in an eat or be eaten world. And that means all of us have our hunter instincts, our innate ability to adapt. And during time periods of chaos, this is actually when we can shine, when we're broken out of all those confines and best practices that are causing us to follow a routine prescription of how things should be done. But what's interesting from an evolutionary perspective is that a lot changed in our brain, in our world, once we discovered farming, which was about 10,000 years ago. Once we planted those first seeds, societies around the world started to flourish because we could predict for the winter. And sure enough, farming has served us well. However, after 10,000 years of evolution as farmers, we are pre-wired to repeat and optimize whatever led to last year's harvest. In a company, that means putting in rules, policies, procedures, structures, brand standards to repeat whatever led to last year's harvest. We farm. Now, there's ways to break out. For this particular part, what I'm going to do is give you a super high level overview, but afterwards you can take our free online assessment tools in order to figure out which hunter instincts are strongest in yourself and which farmer traps impact you. But I'll give you the general overview right now, and you can think about how this happens in perhaps your own organization. At a high level, when we find something that we're good at, whatever that might be, we become loyal to those ideas. We also want to become consistent, and this is where we put in our marketing and brand best practices. We become disciplined, building professions and business units, trying to ensure the consistency of the wonderful work that we've been producing. Now, the problem is that these are all great, but at their extreme, and as we become more successful, the dependency is that loyalty turns into protectiveness. Consistency leans to complacency, unfortunately. And the more disciplined we are, the more repetitive we may become, which are all traps of the farmer that tee us up for disruption. Meanwhile, when we look at what happens when we try something new, our hunter instincts, when you try something new for the first time, you're more curious. You're insatiable, and you want to try new things in every little possible combination. And finally, we become willing to destroy whatever's worked in the past because we have nothing to lose. Now, some of those might feel quite familiar to the sort of COVID-19 period because right now we're able to try new things. We have a permission to fail. Immersed into chaos, we have this hunger, this desire, and this willingness to try new things. And that's partially why chaos creates such opportunity, because in many ways it enables us to exploit our hunter instincts unrestrained. The thing we need to be conscientious of is that our hunter traits also can get to a level that becomes disastrous, which is that curiosity can lead us to be distracted, insatiability can cause us to be too dissatisfied as people, and a willingness to destroy can be perceived by others as being too reckless. In summary, we actually need a balance of our hunter and farmer instincts, and we need to be conscientious that every one of our strengths actually leads to a trap. Now, I'm not going to dive too much deeper into the hunter versus farmer today, but I will say that our assessment tool is really fun when you put your team through it, and it's totally a free tool. And now during these wonderful periods of working from home, there's probably never been a more opportune time to send your whole team through the link, and as soon as you have 10 or more, you'll start to see what makes your team and your group different from other organizations we've benchmarked. So it's all part of our research, so it's totally free, but I encourage you to learn a little bit more about what makes your organization unique. Because everyone wants innovation to happen, but most people don't break from the path. Most don't put in the effort to understand how their hunter versus farmer instincts actually play against each other. The question I would raise to you, particularly in a time period of chaos, would be, how are you counteracting the traps of your own success, which most often boils down to finding new ways to leverage our hunter instincts, being more curious, insatiable, and willing to destroy. Another way to even get at some of that is ask outsiders for opinions. Leverage this time to see who you might interview or talk to in another industry in order to network and get different perspectives on how your own industry might evolve. Finally, simulate what it would be like during this time period if you were to completely start your organization from scratch. All right, this brings us to optionality, which is a term that comes to us from the wonderful world of finance. Optionality is something I like to describe by thinking about our own careers. Somehow after school, I ended up in the wonderful industry of credit cards, but that's not what I really wanted, to be honest. I wanted something different or more creative or fun, and many of you work at all sorts of different organizations, but how did you get there? Because I'll tell you what happened for me. I was trying to pick a major. I liked marketing, I also liked finance, I liked psychology, and then one or two things push things over the limit, and pretty soon you've decided on one, and for me that ended up being finance. Then you get your first job. You pick the job that pays $2,000 more than the other job, and you think, that's okay, I can get in the other industry at any point in time. It's just my first job. But then you get a promotion, you start doing well, and you present your big idea. Maybe you have a life change that happens at the same time. The salary becomes too much to give up, and maybe at this point, if you switch jobs, you stay in the same industry. So at the time, I'm stuck in credit cards, and you're in whatever industry that you've chosen. And all of us can think about the 3 or 5 decisions, or even haphazard decisions, that led us to the point that we're in now. And it's interesting because it shows us that we make fewer big choices than we actually think. Optionality is the concept that you can make choices that open up more options in the future. As a guy that was stuck in credit cards, well, I could go back to school and get a degree. I could go to conferences. I could go to learn what my clients were up to. I could try to network with people in different industries, or I could see where my transferable skills might work. There are all sorts of things you could do that are choices that open up more options in the future. So right now, in a time period of chaos, when you're trying to think about how to reinvent and what to do next, optionality becomes one of the most important concepts to think about. It's the concept that you're actually not trying to make choices based on profitability or non-profitability. What you're trying to do instead is think about what are investments of time and resources that you're making that actually open up your options in the future. And I'll give you a couple fun ways that some of our clients and friends along the way have shown us that you could employ to tactically create optionality in your organization. Debbie Amato is the Deputy Chief Technologist from NASA. I saw them dialed into our webinar today. And for Debbie, she believes you can get more optionality if you try to tackle the departmental silos that can happen. And her problem is that in all of her different groups, they are not necessarily sharing different ideas. So she sees her goal, career-wise, as trying to create collisions that bring different groups together in order to allow them to foster multiple perspectives. One of the ways that she does that is she hosts a poster session where everyone comes and brings their best idea, and she talks about how a new form of science was invented by 2 scientists who were randomly standing next to each other in the poster session. Brian Copeland is the VP Retail and Innovation at Staples, and if you're on his team there and you're embarking on a big exploratory project, he is worried about your fear of failure. And his solution for getting people over that problem is that he will give you a written permission slip to fail, which means we all believe in you. And at the end of the year, Brian will actually host his Penguin Awards, where you could earn a Penguin Award, meaning you're one of the people that took the first leap in icy waters, leading your team to new waters. At Adidas, Mick Lucier, who's the Senior Director of Future Running, had a similar problem with failure, but for him it was that people don't always move on when an idea doesn't work. They don't always move fast enough to the next one. And imagine you're on his team, you make a new running shoe, you spend a year working on it, and now it doesn't work out. Well, you might be tempted to cross the street and get a job at Nike. You might still wiggle that idea into your new projects. And so in order to put that idea to rest, he will host a project funeral to celebrate the success that you had in your learnings, even though the end result wasn't what you'd hoped for. We had Malcolm Gladwell on our Future Festival stage in Toronto, and when he was there, he talked about how his problem, and many people's problem, he believed, is seeing multiple perspectives. And so in order to push himself to see other perspectives, he will try to prove himself wrong. If a person recommends a restaurant to him, and he goes to the restaurant, and he has a bad meal, he thinks it must have been his choice. He will repeat one more visit, ordering something different. He has a strong political belief, and that means you would think you know which news channel he listens to, but he listens to the opposite news channel because he wants to try to understand their perspective. Oh, I got to interview Richard Branson, and I got that lovely picture. Random story, the way you get that is that you've got your phone, you're so excited, hey Richard, can I take a picture? And then a handler comes by and swats it out of your hand and goes, no selfies with Mr. Branson. But I got that one, so sort of proud of that. In my interview with Richard, he said his problem is making sure that he's inspiring ongoing innovation across all of the different teams, and his solution for doing that is to inspire passion. And if you're passionate about your role, then you will indeed bring up more ideas, creating optionality for the company. Steve Wozniak's problem at Apple was people were too focused on short-term results. And sometimes you need people to brainstorm things that are out of scope and think a little deeper. So he would actually have brainstorming meetings and lunches where you weren't allowed to talk about what was in scope. You were only allowed to talk about the further distant future. At Hallmark, Christy, who I think may be on today's call, today's lesson, the problem that she had was a desire for making sure that everything Hallmark does is best in class. And she's got 1,000 creative people that she's got to keep motivated, and her solution is talent exchanges. So she will take her top 6 people to go work with an executive team at, for example, Starbucks, and then get the top 6 people from their team to come to Hallmark, providing ideas for each other. Wrapping all of this section up, everyone wants innovation to happen, but most people don't break from the path. Ways to increase optionality include find opportunities to escape your routine, give permission, fuel audacity, force collisions, ignite passion, push your limits, and deliberately try to be different. This brings us to linear thinking, which is one of the faster sections today. And I'll start off by noting that in the 1950s, the average lifespan of a Fortune 500 company was 75 years. It was like forever. And you wanted to get a job at a blue chip company where things were predictable. Well, that average fell to 15 years, and it's probably already fallen to 8 as we go through our current time period. And what's even more wild is if you look at the list of Fortune 500 companies from the year 2000, you'll find that 52% of them are effectively gone or displaced. And that number is about to rise over the next year or two because companies are built to farm. They are not to built to adapt and make it through different periods of recession and chaotic change. We as humans put in all these rules and policies and structures to create what is a predictable world, and we're able to do that for next year, usually, but actually our world changes at an exponential pace, and if there's anything the year 2020 has taught us so far, it's that it's not so easy to predict exponential change. And beyond thinking of global pandemics, in almost every category, we are experiencing exponential change. And what that means is you need to get your mind frame out of predicting next year and instead start to build the tactics and techniques that are needed in order to adapt to chaos. Now, I have another keynote that you can take a look at called The Super Future, where you can learn a little bit more about some of the technologies impacting us. But to keep things focused on chaos today, I'm going to wrap us up on this section noting everyone wants innovation to happen, but most people don't break from the path. Your workshop question then is, in your industry, what are you doing to internalize the pace of change? Maybe it's finding ways to track the amount of change in your market, brainstorming out what you think the super future will be like 5 to 10 years out, and then shocking yourself into action by realizing how much has actually changed over the last couple years to really internalize the actual pace of change. That's the Cole's Notes super fast version of it, but it brings us to discomfort. For this lesson, I like to ask you, you know how to type? Sure. But do you know how old your keyboard layout is? Have you ever really thought about that? Because it's more than 100 years old. It's from the days of the typewriter. And the QWERTY keyboard is laid out just so, in a way that makes it easy for you to type quickly and not have all the keys mashed together. But decades later, people thought about this problem again and created a new keyboard, the Dvorak keyboard. Everything is laid out differently. And if you want, grab your phone and I'll show you how to permanently change your keyboard so you can have it laid out like this. You'll stumble around, and for the next 6 months it will be tough to do, but after about 6 months you'll be 20 to 30% faster by making fewer mistakes. Cool. Are you ready to switch your keyboard? Probably not. And that example shows us that we're more resistant to change than we think, but also everyone exhibits resistance to change in different aspects of our professional lives. Because saying yes to something new is uncomfortable. It's easier to say no. Saying yes to something when we're busy is also complicated. It's easier to say no. And when we're successful, it's easier to say no. And when it's not our department, it's easier to say nothing at all. Because you know what? I'm just the guy that paints the lines. I'm not the lumberjack. What are you going to do to personally break from the path that you're on? Tactics and methods include finding ways to break a few rules, push harder, act sooner, fail faster, and never give up because you're capable of more than you think. This brings me to the very final lesson, which is about the ease of inaction. And guess what? We've already gone through so many of the different traps of path dependency that the reality is I've given you several tactics you can use to break from the path you're on. But it is easy to do nothing at all. But you're not going to do that because you're an ambitious, creative person out there to think about the path you could be on. Most people don't break from the path, but you are a disruptive thinker and you will create the future. Thank you very much.